I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Holly Jackson, who's an associate professor of English at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, where she teaches courses on American Romanticism, Radical Boston before 1900, queer theory, sex, family, and nation in the American novel, and American Gothic fiction, among other subjects. Professor Jackson is a scholar of both literature and history. She's the author of 2 books. In 2014, she published American Blood, The Ends of the Family in American Literature, 1850 to 1900, with Oxford University Press. Then just 5 years later, she published American Radicals, How 19th Century Protests Shaped the Nation, with Crown Publishers. Now, for a historian, publishing a major monograph in just 5 years is like running a sub-4-minute mile. Really super impressive. Professor Jackson has also published numerous and prize-winning articles in edited volumes in academic journals, including journals like the Journal of 19th Century Americanists, ESQ, a Journal of the American Renaissance, the New England Quarterly, American Literature, and the PMLA. I'll give you just a few titles to get a sense of the impressive range of her work. The Radicals, Reconstruction, Jewett at Port Royal, The Marriage Trap in the Free Love Novel and Queer Critique, The Transformation of American Family Property in the House of the Seven Gables, and Identifying Emma Dunham Kelly, Rethinking Race and Authorship. In addition to her academic publications, Professor Jackson writes as a public intellectual, contributing to conversations about the vote, women's suffrage, and the history of American protest. In 2018, for example, she published How to Protest the 4th of July with the New York Times. And this past fall, she published Beyond Suffrage, It's Time to Fight for the Original and Unfulfilled Goals of the Women's Movement, a really wonderful piece with the Washington Post, and Boston's Forgotten Fight Against Slavery in the Boston Globe. She's committed to using history to reflect critically on the present and to spark activism. And sparking activism is precisely what Professor Jackson's most recent monograph, American Radicals, is likely to do. The history of 19th century protest from 1817 to 1877, the historical actors in this book jump off the page, tackling a plethora of social problems related to slavery and race, sex and gender, property and labor. We meet radical abolitionists, free lovers, early women's suffrage advocates, socialists, and labor organizers. These issues spill into other ones, leading activists to launch protests about prisons, diet, birth control, religious belief, free speech, and imperialism, to name just a few issues that were present in the 19th century and are still with us today. One of the things I loved about the book is how familiar figures like Frederick Douglass or Elizabeth Cady Stanton took on more dimensions, becoming first less familiar and then better known as their historical legacies were made rich and complicated. We see, for example, how freethinker and sex radical Frances Wright was an anti-slavery activist who reproduced some of the very worst characteristics of slavery in her utopian nationalist community in Tennessee. I was also introduced to new historical figures, new to me, like Black abolitionist and businessman Lewis Hayden, Jewish socialist and anti-marriage campaigner Marx Edgeworth Lazarus. A great name. The book explores diverse social and intellectual movements and shows how interconnected the worlds of performers were, whether protesting slavery, marriage, or spicy diets and constricting clothing. American Radicals is a sweeping history that recovers the lives and works of passionate reformers who spent decades trying to realize the original and most radical promise of the American Revolution, to create a true democracy with liberty and justice for all. In their attention to the biggest questions of their day and the smallest details of daily life, these radicals were courageous, prefigurative visionaries. Jackson's lucid prose and razor-sharp analysis help us to understand the legacies of those who struggled to live democratically and create a democratic nation. Professor Jackson is the ideal speaker to start off our day-long exploration of the legacies of suffrage. Her talk today is titled Voting for the Right is Doing Nothing for It, 19th Century American Radicalism and the Turn to Suffrage.
Thank you so much, Professor Kahn. That was an incredibly thoughtful and generous introduction. I'm going to I have a PowerPoint that's up here somewhere. I'm just going to figure out if it's here. It's a little dark in here. Don't go to sleep on it. I'll try to get really animated up here. It's Friday. It's first thing in the morning, and I really appreciate you coming out. just congratulate them on planning such a thoughtful and inspiring event. It's been really thrilling to see this nationwide commemoration of the 19th Amendment this year, turning our attention to women's activism just when we're seeing, hopefully, a kind of resurgence of that energy with the Women's March and the Me Too and other feminist projects that hopefully represent a nascent movement in our own moment. But these festivities also coincide uneasily with the crisis of democratic legitimacy in this election year, as voting rights are suppressed across the country. So many of us are feeling doubt in the system, even as we celebrate our nominal inclusion in it. So I'm really delighted that the program today pairs scholarly speakers on the history of women's activism with an organization like First Amendment First Vote that focuses on the young women voters of the present to safeguard the future of women's political engagement. I really can't wait to learn more about that. So I'm really honored to be part of this conversation. Thank you. So there's my recent book, American Radicals, How 19th Century Protests Shaped the Nation, which centers the deeply intertwined activist projects like anti-slavery, black nationalism, free love, and socialism as major motors of the social and political history of that period, including the Civil War, westward expansion, and industrialization. One story the book tells is how a number of radical programs like the women's movement that initially aim at thoroughgoing social transformation evolved over the course of the century into reform movements of liberal goals like securing the right to vote, even though many of these activists had deeply distrusted official politics and had invested their hope and their hard work in other kinds of engagement. The book ends in 1877 when the suffrage movement as such was really just getting started. But I'm going to focus on that earlier history to highlight some lesser-known moments that offer both inspiration and warnings as we think about what kind of feminism we need now, as we once again confront an electoral system that is not free and equal and universal, as well as many of the same stubborn social issues beyond disenfranchisement that American women faced 200 years ago. I want to suggest that we can trace the roots of our current plague of disenfranchisement to the period that we are now honoring for the victory of universal suffrage. But we can also look there for solutions. As we continue their fight, it's important to understand what the suffrage activists achieved, what remains undone, and importantly, what they wanted beyond basic access to the polls. This history holds valuable lessons for how Americans pursued a broad vision for cultural transformation, even in the absence of the vote, and how we might do again. The first social justice movement to bring together Americans across lines of race, class, and gender on a national scale was the radical anti-slavery movement that emerged around 1830. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, white allies joined the work of free black communities that had been engaged in liberation projects and mutual support for decades to call for an immediate end to slavery. The genius and the ultimate success of this movement hinged on its ability to harness the energy and input of those who were pointedly excluded from official politics, namely men of color and all women. Indeed, women's participation was regarded by many at that time to be as extremist, or even more so, than anti-slavery sentiment itself, and it proved to be a defining bone of contention, even within the movement. But the most radical contingents displayed a truly inspirational disregard for political expediency, a willingness to embrace third-rail social issues where moderates feared to tread, and a principled disgust for compromise when it came to an evil like slavery. The first national activist organization of women was founded under these anti-slavery auspices by a coalition of white and black activists in Philadelphia, including Lucretia Mott, Charlotte Horton, and others. These women staked their claim for legitimacy as abolitionist activists on gender, asserting that enslaved women suffered specific and extreme forms of oppression that free women had a duty to address, especially sexual violence and a particular anguish of motherhood under the slave regime. Yes, although we are women, they said, we still are citizens, and it is to us as women that the captive wives and mothers, sisters and daughters of the South have a particular right to look for help. Lucretia Mott regarded the first convention of the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women in 1837, not the Seneca Falls Convention that she co-organized 11 years later, as the beginning of the women's rights movement. Sarah Horton wrote a poem for the occasion that day, the convention 1837, that addressed white women, and ends with the following couplet. Our skins may differ, but from thee we claim a sister's privilege and a sister's name. The sisterhood's powerful argument may be most associated today with the second wave of American feminism, but when it originated in the 1830s, it was an explicit claim of feminist solidarity across the color line, and a core reason to imagine women's political activity into being. When this group met the following year, in 1838, a mob burned the lecture hall in which they were meeting to the ground. As the angry crowd gathered outside, the women took the podium anyway, attempting to make their addresses heard over the din of swearing and shouting as rocks and brickbats smashed through the windows. White and black women linked arms as they left the hall that night through a dense pack of men, a show of solidarity in case the women of color were singled out for especially violent attacks. In the 1830s, radical anti-slavery work created an extensive network of women activists. This anti-racist movement did not just lay the groundwork for the women's movement. It was in itself a multiracial feminist movement, and one that we look to now as we return to the values of sisterhood in the face of ongoing intimidation and resistance to women's public work. Thus, American women mobilized on mass scale for the first time in the 1830s against the churches, against the press, the government, to end slavery, which they framed as a women's issue. In the same moment, women workers were the vanguard of the emergent labor movement in Massachusetts mill towns. These early women activists used congressional petitions and other tactics to make their voices heard by those in power, but they were not pursuing the right to vote. Indeed, many joined with male colleagues in the anti-slavery movement, who adopted a principled stance against voting. The Boston-based wing of the movement outraged many with their doctrine of non-resistance, a form of pacifist anarchism, repudiating all forms of domination and violence, including prisons, war, and government, as well as patriarchy and white supremacy, and also by including women as full members and leaders in their organization. As non-resistance believed that any form of participation in the pro-slavery U.S. government was immoral, activists like William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Addie Kelly, and Lydia Marie Child, all avid supporters of women's rights, refused to participate in the election of representatives sworn to uphold the Constitution under which 4 million people were enslaved. The only statement of this no-voting doctrine that contemporary Americans are likely to encounter appears in the essay Resistance to Civil Government, something we call Civil Disobedience, by Henry David Thoreau. He wasn't active in the movement, but he was kind of a fellow traveler. His best friends were non-resistance. He said, all voting is a sort of game, like playing checkers, except with moral questions. Even voting for the right is doing nothing for it, he insisted. Like many of his non-resistant friends, he believed the American government to be so irredeemable that the best course of action was to disrupt it and to separate oneself from it as much as possible. Expressing a feeble preference on such a grave moral question as slavery, but ultimately leaving it to the pro-slavery American majority, felt deeply compromising and intolerable to Thoreau and many others. But other abolitionists found non-resistance extremist and distasteful, not only in its open no-government stance, but also in its full inclusion of women. Those with conventional views as to women's roles, and who also believed that abolition must be pursued through electoral politics, increasingly asserted that Garrison had gone so ultra that he was now disgracing the cause. Henry B. Stanton was a New York-based leader of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he was at that time courting a young woman named Elizabeth Cady. He declared that it was, quote, a moral and religious duty for every abolitionist entitled to vote to go to the polls. Any man who refused on any ground whatever must be regarded as a recreant to the cause of the slave. The no-government doctrine, stripped of its disguises, Stanton wrote, goes to the utter overthrow of all order, yea, and of all purity. When carried out, it goes not only for a community of goods, but a community of lives. So you can see there's a complexity around this issue. As his remarks reveal, radical feminism was deeply associated at this time with non-voting, with socialism and atheism and with sex radicalism. Stanton and his allies argued heartily against non-resistance at the National Convention of 1840, arguing that if abolitionists gave up the power of the ballot box, their cause would be lost. This faction objected too, though, to the admission of women, because it was repugnant to the wishes, the wisdom, and moral sense of many of the members, and would bring unnecessary reproach and embarrassment to the cause of the enslaved. This division ran so deep that the organization split in two. the Garrisonians sailed for England to attend the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in June 1840. Having just weathered the splintering of the movement in part over the question of women in leadership positions, Mott and other female delegates were greeted in London with the news that they would not be seated at the convention, as it departed too profoundly from established ideas about the roles of the sexes. They were instead offered positions behind a bar from which to silently observe the proceedings. Arriving a few days later, Garrison joined the women behind the bar in protest, as did a few other male colleagues, including Charles Lennox Reagan, the convention's only African-American delegate. Garrison was then regarded as the leader of the most important anti-slavery movement in the world, so his abstention from the convention was embarrassing to its hosts, and it hamstrung the conversation. Whenever his name was mentioned in the proceedings, the entire room would turn and applaud toward the balcony where he, Reman, and Mott were sequestered, trying to encourage him to rise and address them, but he sat in silence. Mott and Garrison were staying at the same boarding house as Henry B. Stanton, who had just led the charge against them in New York. Indeed, his trip doubled as his honeymoon. Lucretia Mott walked with his vivacious young bride through the streets of London, arm in arm, talking about her exclusion from the convention, women's role in the anti-slavery movement, and the injustice of all the wrong against them. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was floored. She had never met a woman before who believed in the equality of the sexes, openly espousing a view that broke with Orthodox religion. Mott opened to me a new world of thought, she recalled. Siding with Mott and the Garrisonians, she managed to persuade her new husband to vote with them in favor of the inclusion of female delegates. Mrs. Stanton is a fearless woman and goes for women's rights with all her soul, Garrison wrote to his wife. For her part, Stanton admired Garrison's commitment to women's equality and his refusal to abandon his principles on that score, even to advance the anti-slavery cause. After coming 3,000 miles to speak on the subject nearest his heart, she wrote, he nobly shared the enforced silence of the rejected delegates. It was a great act of self-sacrifice that should never be forgotten by women. But unfortunately, this coalitional feminist protest has been forgotten. This is another key moment in the history of women's rights activism, underscoring that justice work requires a vigilant, multi-issue awareness and calls us to sacrifice at times our own privileged voices when others are silenced. After this convention and her honeymoon, Stanton moved to Boston, home of the most dynamic set of progressive intellectuals in the country at that time. So she was part of reform culture. She was going to conventions and lectures and conversations and fundraisers and the like with socialists, non-resistance, transcendentalists, and the slavery crowd. And then she relocated to upstate New York with her husband and young children. And her new rural days were a dreary contrast. And so these quotes are from her autobiography. My life was comparatively solitary, she recalled, and somewhat depressing. I love this picture. I myself have two young children. I love Stan's face in this picture. She's like, y'all are killing me right now. Let's do this. My life was comparatively solitary, somewhat depressing. Her existence seemed to shrink around her domestic duties. To keep a house and grounds in good order, to purchase every article for daily use, keep the wardrobes of half a dozen human beings in proper trim, take the children to dentists, shoemakers, and different schools. As she faced the drudgery of housekeeping without the sparkling conversations of her many friends to provide intellectual stimulation, the restrictions of what most women struggled against began to kind of dawn on her. She was a very privileged person who always lived this very privileged life, and she had plenty of help for childcare. But just then, for this moment when she first moved to Seneca Falls, the nanny wasn't there, and she was doing all the stuff herself. And she was like, "Oh man, this is what women everywhere are doing? This is tough, right?" Stanton turned at that time to a surprising source of feminist inspiration that she had encountered in Boston, which was an 1840 American translation of the French socialist Charles Fourier, which virulently critiqued the burdens placed on women by marriage and the private home. And he had a bunch of really freaky ideas that people knew about and just kind of whispered about that were in the French editions. The American editions really focused on the economic stuff, but it was pretty, it was racist stuff. Stanton was powerfully reminded of his description of the doleful condition of women under the present social system, which he hoped to replace with communal living on a grand scale. Presenting domesticity as poisonous to society and deadly to women's individual fulfillment, he lambasted the trifling occupations of the isolated household and excluding women from the professions of medicine, the higher ranges of teaching, etc., etc. So his vision snapped into place for Stanton at this time, and she writes in her autobiography, Fourier's philanthropy, which was the name of the communist palace that you mentioned, community-like and cooperative households had a new significance for me, she recalled. Viewing her own discontent in light of the socialist analysis, she wrote, impressed me with a strong feeling that some active measures should be taken to remedy the wrongs of society in general, and of women in particular. She understood that her isolation and boredom were systemic, not personal, and were intimately related to the larger exclusion of women from public life, politics, and full citizenship. And it was just then that she was invited to spend the day with Lucretia Mott, who she met in London during that convention 8 years before. Together, they resolved to take action, and they rushed an announcement into a local paper for a convention to be held only 5 days later, on July 19th and 20th, 1848, at Central Falls. At this famous gathering, Elizabeth Cady Stanton read a manifesto that placed suffrage ninth on a list of 12 demands, and it proved to be the only one that was controversial at the Assembly. The other resolutions revealed that in 1848, American women wanted to speak in public as respected authorities, to be judged by the same moral standard as men, to have the same work opportunities and equal wages. They denounced power imbalances in marriage and the psychological warfare that destroyed women's confidence and self-respect. Most of the women present were actually uncomfortable pursuing the vote, convinced that the idea of female voters was so outlandish that it would discredit their more rational objectives and make the whole movement ridiculous. Indeed, a number of them also were dedicated non-resistants and quakers, and they would have refused to go to the polls on principle, even if the law had allowed it. This convention is widely regarded as the beginning of the movement that would, after 70 years of relentless agitation, win for American women the right to vote, but the goal of suffrage was nearly abandoned at Senator Falls before it was adopted. And again, the big challenges that you want to really problematize Senator Falls is from this attempt but so the story goes, Frederick Douglass stepped up in this debate to defend voting rights as indispensable to the women's agenda, arguing that it was the right by which all the others could be secured. After his speech, the resolution to go for women's suffrage passed, but only by a small margin. For feminist activists launching a movement in 1848, suffrage would be a means to securing equality for women, but would not be the goal itself. That's just an important point to me. They saw voting as a way to get these other things that they wanted. They weren't like, yes, the goal here is to vote, to have a legal right to vote. In our attention to the suffrage victory, we tend to forget these other objectives, many of which retain their radical edge today. Stanton, for example, was at least as interested in reforming marriage as in needing the vote as were many others in the room. She wrote to her colleague Susan B. Anthony in 1852 that the right idea of marriage is at the foundation of all reforms, and she aligned herself with free love in a number of ways in the coming decades, much to the chagrin of her more cautious colleagues. In marriage, they stressed, women were exposed to all kinds of horrors under the complete power of men. Even in its best form, the institution took away their property and their very selves, as the legal system of coverture subsumed women's civility under their husbands. But talking down marriage in this way was daring, since one whiff of sexual heterodoxy was enough to permanently discredit any person or set of ideas to which she became attached. Social conservatives and the mainstream press were eager to lump them in, women's rights, women, anti-slavery groups together alongside of free love. The other feminist movement developing at this same moment, also inspired by the former socialist Charles Fourier. Women's subordination in marriage was a central topic of discussion at the annual conventions held in Rochester and Worcester and elsewhere in the 1850s, despite the alarmist press coverage, and though it sometimes proved to be a point of dissension with male allies. And so this is just a little brief story about the first time that Stanton was tangled with Wendell Phillips, and this proved to be a kind of like a consequential falling out after the war. But at the 1860 convention, Stanton launched into an attack on marriage and expressed the most profound respect and loving sympathy for those heroic women who, in the face of law and public sentiment, have dared to sunder the unholy ties of a joyless and loveless union. Intense debate followed about whether marriage was merely a contract, as Stanton said, and if it was even appropriate to discuss the subject at all, given that the public would accuse their movement of further dabbling with free love. For Phillips, there was no question. He took the floor and declared that the laws of marriage and divorce course, rest equally on women and men, and after all, this was not a marriage convention. He moved to strike the foregoing conversation from the recorded proceedings, which was an attempt to suppress material that he deemed too risky. Anthony boomed in response. Nearly all the wrongs of which we complain grow out of the inequality, the injustice of the marriage laws that rob the wife of the right to herself and her children, and make her the slave of the man she marries. Phillips' motion was defeated, as was Stanton's about divorce, although the convention did affirm women's rights to control the custody of our persons in marriage. Perhaps this increasing radicalization on the marriage question would have taken the women's movement in a direction we can scarcely imagine now if there had been a convention of 1861. But there wasn't. These meetings were discontinued during the Civil War. Stanton and Anthony founded the Women's Loyal League, agreeing to press pause on agitation specifically aimed at women's rights and throw their energy behind the Union cause. They spearheaded this huge petition campaign that ultimately did contribute to the passage of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. Before long, Stanton would come to regard the suspension of women's rights during the war as a blunder, an instance of women putting other people ahead of themselves. But this kind of thinking led in the post-war period to a disastrous turn in the movement that pitted former friends and allies against each other and has marred the movement's legacy to this day. After the war, radical activists, even though government men, felt a new optimism about the federal government due to the unanticipated role it played in the abolition of slavery. I mean, it was really a huge shocker that emancipation ultimately came to the government, right? And that the federal army was ultimately a kind of emancipating force. Really, nobody saw that coming. The government had been avowedly pro-slavery in the years of the Civil War. For many, uncompromising utopianism incrementally gave way to political pragmatism in the post-war period. Specifically, former non-resistants came to embrace the importance of the vote in cementing African-American citizenship, just as they had come to support the use of military violence for emancipation. As he took on the mantle of the post-emancipation anti-slavery movement, Wendell Phillips aimed to win as many victories for African-Americans as he could out of the radical Republicans while they still held supermajority in Congress. Even if it meant abandoning the perfectionist mandates that had fired the anti-government movement. So this post-war movement is a really big change in the tenor of American radical socialism. Though radical Republicans in Congress and civil rights activists had many goals and ideas for empowering new Black citizens, including far-reaching economic plans and anti-racist government watchdog programs, Black male suffrage became the focus. They saw the vote as the best way for freed men to protect themselves against the racist violence that gripped the South, as former Confederates fought to regain control of local governments. Like Phillips, Stanton and Anthony knew that the war had provided a rare opening for transformational change, and felt an urgency to seize that moment before it was too late. If the Constitution was going to be changed now, then it was the time to usher in as many of the reforms they had sought as possible. So in 1865, proposals for an amendment to the Constitution started circulating that would grant citizenship status and equal protection under the law to African Americans. Many activists hoped that legislators would approve a draft using the more open term persons to describe American citizens. So there's a possibility there for suffrage for women as well. But the text that Congress ultimately agreed on says male not one but 3 times, just in case there would be no mistake. So this was the first time that women's exclusion from constitutional rights was made very explicit. Stanton and Anthony assumed that the colleges and women had worked for so long in these overlapping causes of abolition of women's rights would denounce this advance toward one goal that was positioned against another. But when they approached Phillips about merging the movements to work for equal rights and universal suffrage, he was not interested. He was a vocal supporter of women's rights, but he began at this time to block discussion of gender issues at the Society's conventions, and he cut off movement funds that had previously gone to women's issues as well. In turn, this is a very famous turn in the women's movement, Stanton and Anthony turned against Black male suffrage. They embraced virulent white supremacist language and arguments that shocked their longtime colleagues and drove the movement to a breaking point. But despite this very unfortunate and shocking opposition, the passage 150 years ago now of the 15th Amendment, allowing for Black male suffrage, was a milestone in the expansion of the vote, and it laid the groundwork in many ways for the 19th Amendment to follow. But in the immediate aftermath of its ratification, that was 15th Amendment, it became clear that even constitutional reform could not ensure the vote in practice. The South was rocked by a white supremacist backlash that spiked around elections, with terrorism against African Americans aimed at barring them from the polls. Much of the grisly bloodshed that dominated this period was then replaced by the quiet violence of bureaucratic disenfranchisement, when in 1876, just 6 years later, the Supreme Court ruled in U.S. versus Roos that, quote, the 15th Amendment does not confer the right of suffrage on anyone. Thus, the legislation in which activists and congressmen alike had placed so much faith and made the centerpiece of their post-war efforts at the expense of other worthy initiatives, had fought and fallen out over, had dreamed of and celebrated, had swiftly been rendered unenforceable by the Supreme Court. The ruling held that it was illegal to bar a person from voting because of their race. But it was not illegal to bar a person from voting with a violence literacy test, a selective poll tax, or a grandfather clause, limiting suffrage to only those whose ancestors could legally vote, even if in the end the results of these things were functionally the same. All Southern state constitutions enshrined these practices and disenfranchised black citizens well into the 20th century. These assaults on democracy developed into a nationwide epidemic. Seeing that these tactics succeeded in the South, economic elites elsewhere used similar tactics to demobilize immigrant, working class, and poor voters, and in northern states added onerous registration procedures to their voter eligibility requirements as well. Corporate money became a major player in elections by 1896, and after that, voter turnout, which had hovered around the robust 80% for most of the century, fell precipitously. Thus, as the electorate officially expanded, the actual franchise constricted. So I'm an English professor, folks, and I made this chart myself, and I know it's okay? First chart I've ever made in my life. It's very terrible, but let me show you, let me explain to you what I meant to, what I meant to express here. So we're starting around 1840. Around 1840 is the time when property requirements fell away for white male voters, and so it was like this moment of democratization. And so the voter turnout was just really high during most of the 19th century. I mean, that's 80% up there. So this is 80% turnout for eligible voters in most of the 19th century. And you'll see that even like with the 1890, let's see where we are here. Yeah, in 1896, so the last presidential election of the 19th century, we still are hitting that point of 80%. And then, as I said, starting with that election of 1896, so political scientists who look at kind of the history of elections see that election as a kind of pivotal moment where it was the introduction of like big money into swaying these elections, and you see just an insane precipitous drop off down to 65% in the first presidential election of the 20th century in 1900, down to 65%, which was at that time unprecedented. I mean, essentially, this is half a century of a 20-point drop, right, after this point. And then this is what is just additionally upsetting. In this context, when we see at the end of Reconstruction that suffrage has been opened up so that it's enfranchising black men, but we're actually seeing voter turnout drop away. A fewer, that kind of small 1% is starting to actually control American elections. In this context, social justice activists might have hesitated to place their faith once again in the electoral system, but on the contrary, the women's movement at this time adopted a single-minded focus on winning a suffrage amendment of their own, finally succeeding, as we know, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. In the election later that year, the election of 1920, the very first to welcome both men and women voters, the turnout fell again to a then historic low of 49%. More Americans could vote, but far fewer did, as onerous registration requirements and other forms of targeted disenfranchisement drove eligible voters from the polls. Today, turnout continues to hover at just about half. So right where we are there in 1920, 1924. We're not in that different of a place. In 2016, I think we were back up to 58, 59%. And that is one of the lowest participation rates among democracies worldwide. It's really encouraging about the voter turnout measure. At a time when elections are compromised by a range of factors, and many Americans are feeling a crisis of confidence in the electoral process, given voter roll purges, gerrymandering, We should take the occasion of the suffrage anniversaries to honor the history of American protest movements and rigorously defend the voting rights that we so hard won. But we should also contemplate their conviction that casting a vote is not sufficient action in times of political crisis. After all, voting is crucially important and uniquely symbolic, but it is not synonymous with civic engagement nor its highest expression. It is important to remember not only that these rights were hard won, but also how tragically easy they have been to take away or put aside in practice. Indeed, these movements demonstrated that ordinary Americans, even when newly disenfranchised, can profoundly reshape the social and political landscape. Without the vote, white women and African Americans tirelessly exerted pressure on the economy, the government, and on public opinion. They organized consumer boycotts, hounded elected officials with petitions, walked off their jobs, and demonstrated in the streets. They wrote and spoke so powerfully that it made constitutional reform imaginable. Now, 100 years later, it falls to us to make it work. American women have a decisive role to play at the polls this year, and we should seize it. But before we declare victory for the women's movement on the suffrage centennial, let's remember its original aims: sisterhood, racial equality, equal wages, public authority, and liberation from subordination in private life as well. Though it took 70 years, suffrage ultimately proved more easily attainable than these goals, which remain ours to pursue.
Thanks so much, Mike, for that fantastic lecture. Let's open the floor up for questions, comments.
You're too wowed by my command of organic. I joke always about how I'm pretending to be a historian, but now I'm pretending to be a social scientist. Yes.
Hi, thank you for.
Can we wait for the mic so it's accessible for people?
Sure.
Thank you so much for an amazing talk. I grew up in Pakistan, where Pakistan became a country after the Voting Rights Act in the United States, like the women's suffrage was passed. But at the same time, I want to get your take on the difference in the social aspect of it, like with privileged women having a different perspective as opposed to women who don't have privilege or have, like in Pakistan, we boast about how we had a female prime minister before U.S. has ever had a female president, but we also need to kind of recognize the fact that Benazir Bhutto, while yes, she was a prime minister, she was also from a very privileged and upper crusty family. So people who grow up without the privilege do not necessarily have the rights, even if it's written into law, because of social constraints. And also another aspect that I really wonder is your chart actually kind of brought me to think about another chart that I saw about the rise of Confederate monuments. It happened around the same time as the voting numbers dropped. I wonder if you kind of saw a parallel with that as well, because of as soon as something good happens in terms of like the voting rights or the Equal Rights Amendment being passed, the rise of the far right and the Confederate and the racist rhetoric also happens at the same time. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, thank you for both of those questions. So two questions or two comments on very different issues. But yeah, that moment there at the end of Reconstruction was just like a horrific moment of backlash in U.S. history, and at the very beginning of Reconstruction, it really was this moment with so much potential, and people felt the possibility for a second founding where the blind spots of the original founders could really be addressed, and there was political will, and like I said, the radical Republicans held a supermajority in Congress, and they could pass legislation over the veto of a very racist president who had been Abraham Lincoln's successor. And it just seemed like things were going the right way, and then there was just a pendulum swing to end all pendulum swings. The as well. But yes, I mean, in other words, this group of people, the Confederates, who had just actually launched a treasonous war against the United States and disbanded the country, they were then being embraced as somehow national heroes, right, and being celebrated with these monuments. And part of the reason that black male suffrage had a lot of support behind it in the beginning was that the service of black men in the Civil War for the Union cause had been pivotal and decisive, right? And so the citizenship status of black men seemed really undeniable in that moment, whereas their white neighbors were temporarily disenfranchised. The people who had been leaders or who had been Confederate sympathizers in the South were temporarily disenfranchised while they were figuring out, like, are these people U.S. citizens again? They just launched war against the United States. So it was a moment where black people in the South actually held a huge amount of electoral power, right? And so then the backlash against that was huge, and it turned out that who was a traitor and who was a hero just turned out a dime in that moment, right? So yeah, just a really tragic and mortifying moment. In terms of the question about privilege and class, it's such an important one. We were talking a little bit about this at dinner last night about who is the woman who can break through in American politics, right? And what will that woman look like? What will be her principles? And in the women's movement, this question of alliances with working women was always a really big issue. So, as I said, Stanton came from a really, as you say, upper crusty background, was very privileged. Her ultimate collaborator, Susan B. Anthony, she actually got, in her account of how she got into the movement, was actually around the issue of wages. So she was a teacher, and she found out that her male colleagues were making twice as much as she was. And she was like, dude, I am not married. I have family to take care of. How am I making half as much as other teachers? This is not fair, right? And so the issue around work and wages was for her always a really big one. And they attempted, I mean, as they were burning their bridges with the anti-slavery crowd and the anti-racist crowd, they were in that moment, they continued to try to really make bridges with the labor movement and to think about working women. But that was also a kind of contentious collaboration where it was a matter of like convincing working women that voting would be the way to do it, right? As opposed to thinking about breaking in the labor unions, and like the labor unions kind of distrusted women's suffrage for a number of reasons. And so yeah, I mean, this is why we talk about intersectionality, which seems like, yay, intersectionality, like let's think about everybody's like social location. But it's more than that, it's about like this complexity of making these actual political collaborations where you take into account these different the different priorities of like stakeholders in an issue like rights for working class and poor women. It's complex, and I appreciate the global perspective there, which I know much less about. Thanks.
We're going to go next. Hi. Once again, thank you for the talk. And my query is sort of, where do you think the radicals are today? You're talking about a group of people who were really, interestingly, like non-resistance, non-engagement, atheists, anarchists, and I know we're still women and minorities still working pushing toward really important sort of representation in a lot of different fields. But I feel like sometimes that comes with a compromise toward supporting a very kind of mainstream type of politics and sort of popular culture. And so I just find it interesting, I think, here at like the university, I'm in the media study department, which is kind of pretty traditionally like radical field here. I have a lot of friends that are artists and poets and things, and kind of radical in their art, and yet they seem to be able to, despite the fact they're disillusioned with Trump saying we want to get him out of office, but they're able to still sort of like have faith in pretty traditional political figures and systems, and I find that really interesting, this sort of like circle back to sort of just a really mainstream kind of politics, and I don't find a lot of radical thinking. So anyways, I wanted to get thoughts about that and contemporary time.
Thank you. Yeah, it's hard to know, isn't it, about the investment in issues around expediency, or in other words, like what's going to work, or like what will the people go for, etc. As as opposed to kind of radical inclinations. Even it's interesting talking about art, and as I said, I'm an English professor by training, and so people in my field are like, somebody like Thoreau who shows up in this talk just for a moment just because I can't help myself. People in English are like, yay, like Thoreau the radical, and I'm like, no. Like, he was friends with people who were actually like risking their lives and who were mobs were burning them down, and they were like, vegan, free-loving, truly fringe leftists. Like, this guy was fine. Like, and so that difference between a kind of like a cultural radicalism and then kind of like actual like social radicalism is an interesting question to me. But in terms of this question about what is it that works, I mean, after I spent this time researching these social movements, and of course we have the benefit of hindsight where we can kind of see what did work or what impact they had to a certain degree, but that's difficult to measure. But the one thing that I'm pretty sure is that you think, for instance, about something like slavery or about something like women's rights, where the perspective of the mainstream was starkly pro-slavery, starkly anti-women's rights at the beginning of the century, and then we see a real shift in that by the end of the century, and like, how did they do it? And I honestly think that these things died to death in 1,000 cuts. And it made me understand a little bit more about the capillary nature of social change. And so, in other words, that moment when I'm like dogging out Henry Louis Stanton there in that moment, and because he was afraid of non-resistance and anarchism and feminism, etc. He and his guys went on to they thought that political abolitionism was the answer, and they formed the Liberty Party, which laid the groundwork for the Republican Party, which elected Abraham Lincoln, right? And in other words, like, they did it. He and Garrett Smith, who was Katie Stanton's cousin, they believed that the political methods could be harnessed for radical change, and they went that direction. While Garrison and his group were outsiders who they were resistance, and other people were actually on the ground doing liberation projects, like, actually risking their lives to bring people out of the South. And so all of these different forms of resistance, it was just drip, drip, drip until it just became irresistible, right? And I think about this around something now like the climate crisis, because at the beginning of doing this book, I was kind of like, can I just get a straw? Like, is the world gonna end if I can just get a straw from this iced coffee? But now I get it. Like, I get the kind of the consumer awareness part of it, and the fact that we're now seeing a kind of a threshold, a mainstream threshold of awareness about climate stuff reached. It's because of this really capillary approach that does come from thinking about straws, but that also comes from like an attention to the militaries and governments and these huge formations. And so I think that we have to just continue. We have to have a belief in all of these ways of launching protests and of trying to build some kind of resistance. Because I think I actually think that it's kind of in the presence of these forces coming from all directions that change will happen.
Okay, one over here, now I'll come down towards the front.
Hi, my name is Juanita Williams. I want to thank you too for doing this. This is a good conversation to have. So timely what we're seeing in the presidential level. I wanted to go back to some of the comments that were made earlier. I'm someone who's lucky enough, and I have tried twice unsuccessfully to run for political office in upstate New York, primarily in white communities. And thinking about some of the comments that were made earlier, what has been presented to me in a number of ways, and not articulated this way, but it made me think about some of the conversations or what you were presenting early on in your book, and that is this concept that has been presented to me is this idea of having a white privileged surrogate as the person who leads the way for someone to make change. And so many times during my political runs, I would hear, pretty much, so who's the white leader that's helping you do this? I mean, it was always kind of put out that way to me. And there was this thinking that if you were going to be a woman of color as a political leader, you had to have a white privileged surrogate who would lead the way. So thinking about that, I was just, in hearing you, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that when we see these ladies in the suffrage movement trying to make movement. Was that part of this too? Was there this piece of having some kind of surrogate that was helping them make some of their movement?
Ooh. Yeah. Well, thanks for what you're doing. I hope you'll stick with it. Yeah. I mean, when you see, that PowerPoint that they had circulating when we were just having breakfast, you see the squad on there, and it feels like, at the beginning of this cycle, this election cycle, there's this feeling like maybe there's some real energy around seeing that kind of leadership, and that I just hope that they really represent this year in a certain way, and that is where we're going as progressives and on the left. Then, no, this past week has just precisely not that, has it? So it's tough to know. But yeah, yes, the women's suffrage movement, this question of what is a woman, right? Like, in other words, is a woman a white woman? And then the question is, like, how do we get in coalition with women of color, right? That coming from that kind of perspective has been a problem from the beginning. And I think we're I'm sure, going to hear from other speakers about the fact that there were multiple women's movements and that there are multiple feminisms then and now. And as I said, in the 1830s, these women who were in Lowell, Massachusetts, like doing these work slowdowns and stoppages, they didn't see themselves as having a feminist movement. They saw themselves as having a kind of a labor movement, right? But they were the leaders of it, and they were women, and they were sort of they were grabbing this public authority that did not belong to them, did not be easily. And so, I do think we have to look at the history and think about and look at who are the women of color, who are the women who do not have those voices. But also, in the book, it's interesting because some leaders, like William Lloyd Garrison, succeeded in. He was not a charismatic individual. He was not himself much of a. He was not this iconoclastic person. His genius was that he was an organizer, and that honestly, people trusted him. Like the black community in Boston stood behind him when the movement broke up, and they bankrolled him. He was this kind of man in Philadelphia, a very rich free man of color. James Morton bankrolled the Liberator for years when it first started, and he had the ability to give a megaphone to communities of color and to accept leadership from communities of color. And in a way, he understood, I think, that he had white privilege, and he could have a newspaper, and he could talk in public, and he could go if he wanted to, etc. But he really had kind of that genius for allyship. And there are these little moments of that in history that we can try to look to and figure out why he was good at it and why Elizabeth Stanton was so spectacularly disastrously bad at it, right? And so I think that for white people, that's important study too.
So thank you for your talk. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
I'm afraid I'm going to turn from that really powerful question to a more strictly historical question.
Oh no, okay.
Card carrying historian.
Oh God.
So
I asked for it. Go ahead.
I haven't read your book, American Radicals, but that will change soon, especially after Susan's introduction. It sounds fantastic. I was struck in Susan's introduction that she didn't mention, I don't think she mentioned temperance. I don't know if you talk about temperance in your book, if you talk about it here. Obviously, it was one of, if not the largest social movement of the first half of the 19th century, dominated by women. It doesn't look quite so good from today's perspective as some of these other movements, not quite on the same side as some of this would be. And so I wonder about the lessons of temperance in terms of the limits or dangers of their coercive model of social change. If that's a counterpoint to the story that you tell in your book at all, if that appears, just what role that plays.
It's a very good question because right around that same moment, around this question of who could be included in conventions. I mean, the big one was like the whole world temperance convention, where there was it's just like this anti-slavery convention. There had been a temperance convention that excluded women, which was ridiculous, as you said, because it was largely a women's movement. And so Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Lucy Stone and others created this whole world temperance convention, and that too was a moment in the history of women's organizing nor do I talk about the many religious-based movements of the period also. My focus is just secular, but also for temperance, I think it's a really interesting question because the movements that I talk about didn't just want social change, they want social justice. So there were lots and lots of movements that want social change in general, and I can't, for me, I don't see temperance as a social justice movement. They definitely want social change, but as you're suggesting, it was more about social control. And there were a lot of elements of it that were kind of nativist and whatever, but it was, as you said, it's complex because it was running right along the stream of generating this energy in these networks that were feeding to and from anti-slavery and the women's movement, even though it had this really different perspective that was not strictly about justice, although they did see it as, they saw it as that it would have an ameliorating effect for working people effectively. But it was paternalistic, it was nativist, et cetera. So no, it's a good question.
Another historian here.
Yep, hi.
I thank you so much for that. I really like your framing of this. It's actually, this question follows the previous one, which is who are these radicals and who counts as radical? So you have transcendentalists and sex radicals and abolitionists, anti-slavery people, feminists, and obviously they're not, the term feminism is pre-term, but we identify them as such. So how do you put all those together? How did you come to a working definition of radical to figure out who to believe in and who to move out?
Yeah, so my sense is that, and I tried not to, I wrote this book for a general audience, and so I tried not to go to sort of stall the process by going into like these deep academic like holes about, like I used to talk about like countercultures, and I'd go to the talk and people would like talk to me about the difference between culture and counterculture, and I would just feel like I was falling through space, and I was like, you know what I mean? And so I tried not to do that, but they themselves talked so much about what radicalism meant and about striking at root, as they called it, and about breaking every yoke, right? That it was not difficult to see what activists had kind of like a multi-issue coalitional idea about social change as opposed to kind of isolated legal reforms. And even so, within something like Friends of the Labor Movement, this was a real tension, and you see differences where some people, rightfully so, were like, "Hey, I want a 10-hour workday. Can I get a guarantee that the workday will be longer than 10 hours?" Right? That's a legal reform. That's something that the government and legislators say we will legislate a 10-hour workday, and that there is a tension there between people who are like, "No, man, you don't get it. What we need is like socialist utopia, right? Like don't focus on the 10-hour workday. That's too specific, right?" And that there is, and again, there's a class privilege that goes into thinking like that, and both are kind of necessary. But really, I just try to. My view is that everybody that I talk about in the book, all of these movements, had a more radical orientation before the Civil War, and this is not new. I mean, this is a kind of standard way to tell the story. And that, again, that there was a surprising trust in the government in that post-Civil War moment that proved to be misplaced. And so a lot of these movements turned away from this really radical orientation that was multi-issue. I mean, in the first years of the Liberator, you're seeing like advocacy for interracial marriage, you're seeing kind of anti-settler colonialism, you're definitely seeing labor stuff, you're seeing women's stuff. It was really not just an anti-slavery movement, but it was a movement where racial justice was the centerpiece, but it was a radical coalition, right? And that to me was kind of surprising and really inspiring. And then I do think you see a constriction as the century goes on. And in fact, something like the temperance movement ends up being a model for the kind of movements that you see replacing these things after Reconstruction and the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. So that's all. I mean, that's basically my sense of how radicalism works from liberalism, even if they're not speaking from the same thing.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. Early on, you mentioned that there were some
I mean, I've just been thinking lately about that old term that I tried to ring the little bell of twice in this talk, which is just like sisterhood. And I think that's just an unpopular idea right now in a certain way. But when I read that, when I read about that Philadelphia Convention in 1838, when a mob is gathering outside and smashing the windows in and saying, no, like women are, like, first of all, there is a crowd here of these weird, reformed, liberal weirdos who are black and white together, and women are speaking in public in there. We won't have that. And they're literally burning down the building. And these women who, they were honestly at the beginning, I mean, even in the 1840s, when you read these accounts of the early women's conventions, which is 10 years later than this, 11, 12 years later than this, they talk about how women, it was so weird for a woman to stand up in front of people and talk that some of them could barely get it out. I mean, you still see this. I mean, this is something that still plagues women to this day. I mean, and I know those of you sitting in the audience, like I'm sure many of you know me on that. It is hard to be a woman speaking in public. It just is. And for them, they would shake. They could barely read the minutes. But those women were standing up with men smashing in the door, and they read their speeches anyway, even though they were afraid. And then they walked out arm in arm and saying, like, "Let's be sisters." I think it's powerful. And I feel like that we've lost some of that sense of that we are still. Our battles don't look like that anymore. Our battles are around things like electability and like other euphemistic words about how women should never speak in public. But still, like, we are there, and we should think about like, what it means for women to get out there and continue to be brave in the face of failure, in the face of opposition, and in the face of just tiresome nonsense day in and day out, and what sisterhood means in that context. And I also think that the point that I was trying to make is that feminist movements were taking place in the context of movements that were primarily about race, and in movements that were primarily about economic justice, and that feminism was really centrally focused on private forms of inequality in marriage and in the home, as well as public things like elected representation, and that all of these things are forms of really crucial feminist work that are still here and are still alive, and when you really look at this history that is from the early 19th century, to me it just seems kind of almost scarily resonant, like too similar. You know what I mean? As if like we've seen these huge changes and yet it's just too close.
All right, that's a good place to end our discussion. I'm sure you will be mobbed during the break. We are going to extend our coffee break now, so I'll grab some refreshments, grab some coffee, use the restroom, and join us back here in a few minutes for Dr. Lisa Tetro's fascinating talk.